than 1 billion women worldwide still having no access to the global financial system, it is considered to be one of the greatest obstacles to the economic empowerment of women. And while it is estimated that 1 in 3 companies is owned by women, they often struggle to get access to loans. But why? This is one of the questions we hopefully will be answering here today on the panel. So in the upcoming 70 minutes, we want to dive into the world of finance, loans, and the economy of trust, and ask, do women make better borrowers? To answer this question, we have 3 remarkable women here on the panel, one of which is Linda Scott, who will kick-start our discussion with a short impulse. So let me quickly introduce to you Linda Scott. Before I ask her to come on stage, she is Emeritus Professor of Entrepreneurship and Innovation at the University of Oxford, a visiting professor at Brown University, where she teaches gender and economics, and a consultant to the World Bank. She is the author of The Double X Economy, a book that deeply documents the worldwide and historical pattern of women's economic exclusion and makes a passionate argument for the economic and humanitarian reasons to eliminate this destructive inequality. And this book was translated, I think, into 15 languages, and you can also get it outside. I highly recommend it. And please join me in welcoming Linda Scott. The stage is yours.
Thank you. Okay, so I have 10 minutes and 5 slides to introduce you to some information that will be new to some of you, will be shocking to all of you, and will be preposterous to some of you. So I'm going to ask you, just for the next 10 minutes, to trust me and my credentials while I explain this to you, knowing that when I'm done, you can ask me questions about it. You can ask me to put my money where my mouth is, but you can also look at the book and see the footnotes. And almost all of what I will show you today is available freely and publicly on the internet from institutions like the World Bank. So you can check it yourself. I'm going to start with this first slide, which, sorry, I've got this upside down. There we go. Which is a nice snapshot of the total system I'm going to try to introduce you to today. On the vertical axis, what you have here is GDP per capita. On the horizontal axis, you have women's economic empowerment as an index computed by the Economist Intelligence Unit. And you can see that there's a very clear relationship, positive relationship, meaning that as women's economic empowerment increases, so does GDP. Now, when this correlation was first discovered back in about 2005 by the World Economic Forum, I would think that's fair, people just said, oh, well, it's just a correlation. It means nothing. It just happens to be. There's nothing causal here. But there's been a lot of research since then, and we can say with firmness here is that there is a causal relationship here, all right, that the rich nations, it is not the case, as people said, that they were rich and so they could afford to free their women. In fact, it was quite the opposite. It was that freeing their women made them rich. But it is also true in the reverse that these countries down here, push the wrong button there, that these countries down here, where women's empowerment is very low, and GDP is very low, okay, are keeping themselves poor by excluding their women from the economy. You can at this point summarize the upward swing of this graph by saying that it basically represents a more productive use of resources by educating the whole population, by allowing anyone in the population to work, by allowing access to capital, access to all kinds of resources. Those economies have expanded and grown. On the downswing, however, there's a whole different phenomenon happening because there are humanitarian issues, costly problems that occur as a result of the lack of sovereignty that women have in those countries. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. You find more hunger and it's related. You find more war, and it's related. You find more disease, and it's related. And so, and I will explain to you an example of how that works as I go forward today. But the important thing I want to point to here, though, is that GDP in this case is just standing. I'm using it as a proxy for all of those things. This is not just about GDP. It just makes a convenient snapshot for me to introduce you to this information. All right, so we're going to start with girls' education. This is a relationship that has been known for a very long time, but posed something of a puzzle at first. Again, what you have this time on the horizontal axis is GDP per capita, and along the vertical axis is that you have enrollment, female enrollment in secondary school. And what you see is, again, a positive relationship, which as more girls remain in secondary school, the higher the GDP. And at first what people said was, or surmised or hypothesized, was that it was because educated girls added to the quantity and quality of the workforce. It was a bit of it was a hypothesis, and the truth of it turned out to be quite a bit different. It was much more complex because it was the costs of the downside that was driving this graph. All right, this is GDP, also on the horizontal axis, and this time you have adolescent fertility. And you can see that there is an opposite relationship. In other words, the more girls stay in secondary school, the higher GDP there is, and the fewer girls have a lot of children, girls here we're talking, the fewer girls have a lot of children, the more the GDP is. And after investigation, what this turns out to be caused by the practices that keep the girls out of school and make them get pregnant too early. Adolescent fertility is extremely dangerous for women that are too young to be pregnant. It results in high maternal mortality and high infant mortality, which is costly as well as tragic for a nation. But the circumstances that cause that to be the case are things like forced marriage, child marriage, human trafficking, and toleration of rape. And that's why you have that phenomenon happening there. All of those things, in turn, cost governments and societies dearly because of all the evil, basically, that spins off of those things. So the implication here, all right, is more than about just education and labor. It's a question of sexual sovereignty. And I'll bet you didn't expect that to be connected to GDP. So that's a first surprise. Okay, because it has all of these terrible, costly negative effects. Childhood, child marriage, forced marriage and rape, high adolescent fertility, all of these things. Hunger, because it expands the population because the window for childbearing is larger. Violence, runaways and trafficking, which feeds organized crime, which of course adds to international instability. It has effect on all of us. And it makes essentially a self-perpetuating spiral. All of these things start to feed on each other. Now, probably the most powerful part of this terrible soup of suffering is the high fertility. Hang on just a minute. Oh, I forgot, sorry. One of the important things that we found out about this, we as a community of people, which there is at this point, multiple disciplines, multiple institutions studying this, is that it's very important to keep boys in school as well, but there's a multiplier effect that happens when you keep girls in school, and it's because of all this sort of radiation of costly and terrible problems. However, it also is something that, if you can fix it, has a real rapid response. And that's because if you can keep a girl in school instead of till she's 15 until she's 18, and just that keeps her from having children quite as early, it relieves all of these things that I've been talking about within a couple of years. So it's something that people have been very, very focused on, not only because we, of course, want all children to be educated, but because we know now how much this will mean to the entire world. Okay, so just to give you a sense then for what the macro implications are, if you can imagine girls all over the world being kept out of school because they're being forced to marry and raped and all of this, you can look at it from the point of view of the distribution of fertility. It's important to understand that fertility is not the same thing as the birth rate. Birth rate is just how many children women have been having lately, this month, next month, last quarter, and it can vary with anything, the economy, the average rainfall, who won the World Cup, it really doesn't matter in my world. What does matter is the fertility rate, which is a generational measure. It's how many children a woman has on average during the course of her lifetime. So it's a much more important and powerful thing. All right, in this graph, in this map, the lighter colors are nations that have a low birth rate below the replacement rate, which is 2 per woman, 2.1 per woman. About half of the world at this point is at or below the replacement rate. Most of us think we have a population explosion, but actually that is very much focused in essentially one part of the world. See if I can get this going. And that is Africa and Central Asia, and a little bit down over here. And if I were to start calling out the countries that are the deepest red here, I would call out places like Chad and Congo, Yemen, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Papua New Guinea. All of them would be essentially headline news, all right, poster children for civil and international conflict. And these are not an accident from a gender point of view, because we know that where fertility is its highest, we have the most fragile and unstable countries in the world. 35 of the most fertile nations on Earth, 27 of them are in the bottom 50 of the global gender gap rankings. 2/3 of them are listed among the most fragile states in the world. 90% of them are autocracies, and they are 8 times more likely to have experienced conflict over the last 50 years. So it's a very strong correlation. And the question is then, why would that be the case? Well, when it develops a very lopsided age structure for a population when you have too much fertility. And so you squeeze things like food right away and other resources. When people are hungry, they fight, right? And so a lot of stuff then, disease burden and everything starts to grow from that. Eventually, it becomes unstable, and there's a desire for order, so they often fall into autocracy, but it keeps happening and keeps happening as the resources get more and more squeezed. Now, but another thing that propels this, and it's hard to say, it's kind of chicken and egg, but what causes the women to have so little sovereignty is an ancient, an antique idea of masculinity. Right? This is extremely controlling, but is also one where being strong means being not compassionate, for example, and where violence is a measure of manhood, where conflict happens quickly and sometimes rashly. And so it's a thing that is very much rooted in the gender relations on the ground. Now, in the question and answer period, I hope someone will ask me about how does this relate to Ukraine, right? Because that is posing my whole community an exception that we have to figure out. Okay, a lot of the stuff that's happening here is because the girls aren't seen to have any economic value, and it's rooted in the fact that they can't inherit land. They're not allowed to inherit land. And this means that the families prefer the son. They invest in the son, including sending him to school, and they marry off the girl because that's how they liquidate that asset. Okay. This is a graph where you have a scatter plot where you have 106 developed and developing countries. They're just entered alphabetically, Algeria to Zambia. All right, and this is the percent of total individuals holding land. So the black dots at the top are the percent in that country that own land who are male. And the red dots are the percent in that country of landowners who are female. All right, and you can see right off the bat that there's quite a strong pattern here. We could not say this is a random pattern. And it's also one that really must be the result of something heavy and structural. And so when I first discovered this relationship, I dug into the question, is it possible that all these countries have a history of not letting women inherit land? And the answer to that is yes. That the gender problems that the world experiences, and all of the countries of the world have a gender problem, is part of a shared culture. It's not an idiosyncratic culture. It's a history that we all share. And women have been not allowed to own land for at least 4,000 years in writing, right? And so getting then toward our topic for today, what that has meant, because land has traditionally been the main source and store of wealth, it has meant that women were excluded from it, that they depended on men for every necessity of life. But it also meant that they were excluded when this land started to roll up into capital. What this chart shows us is that men controlled about 80% of the world's surface. And it also means, because it is the source of capital, that they control 80% of the capital as well. And that is also true of capital in other forms. It is also the case that the financial system has excluded women for as long as it has been in existence, in part by denying women the education that they need to interact with the system. And what that means then is that they've not been able to get credit. They've not been able to get any kind of business assistance, but also that they've not even been able to have banking or savings accounts. And I want you to think about what that, because basically what has happened is that women have, it's not just that they've not been allowed to work, it's that they have been excluded from the entire money system. And that is what is causing this. It is an interference, not only in their economic rights, but in their human rights. It's bad for their freedom, and it's bad for all of our safety. So I hope that this will give you a little bit of a frame for why these things are so important.
Thank you so much. Now stay with me. Come, you don't have to come and stay with me on stage.
Okay,
Thank you so much for this very interesting input to kickstart our discussion here. We will talk a lot about this. And let me bring Prudence Muchinouta with us on stage. Please join us. And the third on this panel is Smitha Radhakrishnan. Unfortunately, she couldn't be with us today in person, but she is so kind to join us via video stream. Hi, Smitha, now I can see you. Hi. Unfortunately,
Hi.
she couldn't travel, but we're so happy you took the time to be with us today via video stream, although it's really early, I think, where you are. So thank you for that. Thank you for that. Let me introduce you and Prudence to our audience so they know who you are. Smitha Radhakrishnan is a professor of women's studies and sociology at Wellesley College in Massachusetts. Her research examines the cultural, financial, and political dimensions of gender and globalization, with particular focus on India, the US, and South Africa. Her recent book, Making Women Pay, Microfinance in Urban India, analyzes the relationships between commercial financial institutions and the everyday livelihoods of working class women. So warm welcome to you, Smitha. And Prudence Muchinouta, we're very happy you came all the way from Zambia to be with us here. She is the current Chief Financial Officer of the Community Market for Conservation Limited, a social enterprise operating a model that focuses on enhancing systems that incentivizes conservation of natural resources. She's also a fellow of the Chartered Association of Certified Accountants, where she was awarded the ACCA Africa CFO Award in the Environment, Social and Governance sector category. She is a member of the Rallying Cry Network, supporting climate and gender-responsive agriculture enterprises in Africa. A warm welcome to you. Now, we're very happy you're with us. Linda, let's start with you. You said just now, and you recently said in a speech, and you've said it before, that 40% of global GDP is contributed by women. that women make up to 75% of consumer decisions in the world, and women own 30% of global businesses. But they get only 5%, if at all, of conventional business loans from banks. Why do banks, quite obviously, not trust women, although there is no factual reason for it?
Let me add one more statistic. They also produce more than half than the world's food supply. Okay, and so they are, one might say, as we say in America, the elephant in the room. They're a huge factor in the global economy, and there's no good excuse for why we keep ignoring them, and we tend to treat them as if they were trivial, and their topic of their economic viability is unimportant. The situation with the banks, I would say, I've been working in this field now for 15 years. Both on the ground and analyzing the statistics. And I have to say that the financial system and the hostility from the financial system is probably the single biggest barrier. And it has to do with a very long history of exclusion of the money system that bankers now use as an excuse and call it objective. So they'll say things like, and this happens especially in Africa, I have found, they'll say they can't loan money to women because they need to have collateral and they will only accept land. Oh, and that's objective? Really? Right? So you can see that the inequality becomes systemic. All right. And then there's prejudice, and most of the institutions of the global banking and financial system are male. It's it's one of the most dominant, male-dominant areas of the economy. And what that means, and I explain this in my book, is that there's just really a lot of contempt for women that gets generated in that kind of an all-male environment. So it kind of feeds on itself. They tell themselves myths like women can't do math, so they can't do finance, which is not true. Neither one of those things. So it's a problem, but that's it. They don't behave well. Is the short answer.
Yeah, of course, it's a big topic. Prudence, you are a finance expert, a banker, and an accountant. So, from your expertise in this field, what are some of the key reasons why women often face greater challenges in accessing credits and loans compared to men? What do you think?
Pleasure to be here once again. So generally, I would put it at this, is women are more productive and women are busy taking care of the world's problems, and that's why they're disqualified. So you find that many of the women are the ones that are figuring out, and I'm speaking from an African context, women are the ones that are figuring out where to get the food to feed their families, where to find money to send their children to school. And in turn, the financial system is looking at these women as not being productive enough in the way that they have described it. And yet, they are actually controlling everything and are handling all the problems. Now, when a woman wants to go to the bank, apply for a loan, Linda has mentioned, you refer them to not having adequate collateral, and yet the system can evolve. And I think this is an intention or an intentional decision that the system has denied women for so long. We have many other sources of collateral that can be utilized or that can be accepted by the financial system, because women have proven themselves over and over again, and yet they seem to be disqualified because they don't have land or they don't have non-movable assets, which is very unfortunate.
Yes, we just heard from Linda. I mean, the land, that 80% of the surface is owned by men. I mean, that's crazy. Just this figure is really crazy. Smitha, one way of getting women access to financial resources are microloans. You are a sociologist. You have been researching finance and microfinance. What is the idea behind microfinance? How do microloans differ from other types of loans? Maybe you can give us a little overview of that.
Sure. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, fantastic.
Okay, great. Thank you for having me, and pleased to be a part of this discussion. I'm sorry I'm not well enough to travel and be there in person. So I think my perspective differs a little bit from the other panelists. Hopefully we can get into some of those details. But to directly answer your question, the idea behind microloans is specifically to address this issue of lack of collateral. The idea behind it in general is that women can take loans in a group, and that would make them creditworthy, right? Because they would be relying on their connections to one another in order to be able to ensure that everyone in the group pays back. This is a very abstract idea. So one of the things that my research shows, so some of you might have heard about this idea and its success in Bangladesh in the context of the Grameen Bank and Muhammad Yunus, who won the Nobel Prize in 2006 for his work with the Grameen Bank. He was also, that prize was won with BRAC, the Bangladesh Rural Advancement Committee, which is often forgotten, but they both won it jointly for the same intervention. However, when microfinance today is a much, much bigger industry, and it comes in many, many forms. So I want us to kind of open up the discussion, if possible, to not necessarily think of microfinance giving women loans as the solution to all of the issues, the structural issues that women face. Yeah. And we can, I don't know how much detail you want me to go into.
No, but actually I would like to go into, I think that's quite interesting what you say, because, you know, we've heard of Muhammad Yunus and the Grameen Bank, and at this I mean, microfinance is always viewed as a model of success, and people trust in this system, and we're coming back to trust. But you show in your new book, and you just, you know, mentioned it as well, that you show that that India's microfinance industry had not just drifted away from its outward mission to serve excluded women, but that microfinance institutions seldom consider the real needs of women in their strategizing. I think you write, on the contrary, you say that their everyday functioning systematically reinforces gender inequality, both within their organizations and in their interactions with clients. You argue that microfinance can become an incalculable risk for women. So can you tell us more about this risk? I mean, how is it that we, you know, lots of people in the West especially see it as such a story of success, and you actually argue that it is not, and it's actually, you know, posing a risk. Maybe you can tell us how this contributes, you know, why the system is not working from your point of view.
Sure. Well, first I want to address the fact that many of us in the West have a very idealized version of what microfinance is. It's because we like the linear story. We feel that we can address structural gender inequality with a nice linear story which centers the individual as if she has no context at all. So we say, okay, you take a woman in a third world country, you give her a loan, she starts a business, she makes the business grow, she pulls her family out of poverty, she does all the hard work of taking care of her family, her community, and therefore she lifts everything up. That sounds great, and I think that's really appealing to those of us in the West who are unfamiliar with the everyday pressures that women all around the world face. And I don't think this is particular to women who are living in the global South or in developing countries. I don't think most people living in the US or Europe would want to be tasked with taking a loan and pulling their entire family out of poverty on the basis of a small micro business, right? So we tend to put a lot of stock into this idea without necessarily thinking through, well, what kind of burden does that actually put on a person who's just trying to get by, who is also already facing a lot of structural barriers? So that's the first thing I want us to kind of consider about our own taken for granted understandings of what we think a small loan will do. So we're much more willing to say, well, let's think about giving women small loans than we are to think about what are the structural social provisions that are available in parts of the world, and what is the role of the West in either providing or not providing various parts of the world support in the form of, I mean, there's punitive loan structures internationally, there's all kinds of other structures that we can talk about to ensure that all people, and especially women, have access to sustainable livelihoods. So that's a little bit about kind of our perspective on it. As far as India's microfinance industry goes, microfinance in India, as in many parts of the world, is a diverse financial product. There's a state-led variety, which are called self-help groups. There is a commercial variety, which are run today primarily by financial institutions. Those financial institutions are beholden to their shareholders. Those at the top are mostly privileged men, and they control shareholder entry and exit, and they're concerned, or investor entry and exit, and they're concerned with making sure that the people who invest X billions of dollars will exit with 20% more than the X that they put in the first place. So that's what's driving their strategy. On the face of it, however, they show lots of women taking out loans, buying cows, doing all these different things that make outside investors very happy and make outside investors feel like they're making a huge impact. Now, when you go on the ground, which is what I did, and speak to women borrowers, the workers who serve them, those who are working within the institutions, it's quite a different picture. The women borrowers are incredibly, incredibly resourceful. However, the majority of what they're doing is moving money around from various loan sources in order to be able to put together a livelihood, precisely because they are blocked from access to, yes, land ownership, also healthcare, also basic education for their children. So they're using these loans not to start businesses and pull their families out of poverty, but rather to put together enough resources to, for example, fund an overdue hysterectomy or complete the college fees for a child who has been unable to be educated to the extent possible to build a bathroom in their home, these types of expenses. And their routine, many of the people that I talked to have been borrowers for many, many years, and that serves the financial company extremely well because they are able to lend out at 25, 30% interest plus fees to the same borrowers who are trusted and vetted for over a decade or more, which is very profitable to the financial industry. So the financial industry, including women into the financial industry, but on adverse terms, does not necessarily center the actual struggles that women are going through to serve themselves and their communities and their families. So that's just an outline. I'm happy to talk about any part of that in more depth.
Do you see, maybe just as a quick wrap-up, do you see any more promising alternatives to microfinance that can or already support women's economic empowerment through financial inclusion?
So I think that the field of financial inclusion is huge, and I think microfinance institutions, in the Indian context in particularly, have done something quite historic in establishing trust between those communities that are currently taking loans and the mainstream financial system. And there's certain historical reasons why that connection has not been made in the past. So I actually think what there needs to be, not necessarily an abolishment, but a complete overhaul in terms of the structures of accountability. And in terms of what strategically microfinance institutions are doing, who they are accountable to, and who gets to decide the terms of the loans, how they are vetted, and who they're serving in the short and long term, fees, interest rates, all of that stuff. Mm-hmm. So it's not that the financial flows, I think the connections that they've established are historic and important. The way that they actually get carried out and the kinds of financial institutions that do that work, there is a lot of room for a revisiting of accountability in order to look at those structures.
I see Linda wanted to react to this.
Yeah, I do want to talk. I have a good bit of experience in the field with microfinance groups. In my experience, most of them operate through what are often called village savings organizations, and they're usually all women. They don't borrow from the financial industry. They borrow from their own savings. And I agree that I was horrified to find out that Citibank, at least at one point, was the largest lender of microfinance in the world. That's a scary thought. Yeah. You can be sure they're not doing it for the good of humanity. Quite sure. So we totally agree on that. I do think that, though, I have seen a lot of benefits to microfinance. I think there are preferable ways of funding businesses, but it does give women the opportunity to have control over some cash. It gives them, because they're usually done in women's circles, it allows them a women-only private space to deal with money and learn about how to manage it, and that's very important because otherwise they're bullied and money is taken away from them. It creates a feeling of solidarity that is crucial. If you're going to stand up to the brotherhood, you got to have a sisterhood, is my feeling. And those women's savings circles do a really good job of that. I also think that you don't have to start a business in order for this to be worthwhile. One of the reasons that one of the biggest investors in women's saving is Care. It's a charity, they've been doing it since the 90s, and they do it because their research shows that the families in the community have higher nutrition and the children are more likely to be in school if the mother has control over some money. And I think that from a global point of view, that's a good that is hard to price. You know, I think kids in school and good food for people who are hungry is good. So, well, I don't disagree with the big picture here. I do think it's a little more subtle.
Can I just add to that quick?
Of course.
So I think part of what we're talking about here is we need to disaggregate our understanding of microfinance. So there's a commercial set. We're talking about it as if it's one thing. It's many different things. So what Linda described in terms of the village savings groups and all women control and no involvement of the financial sector, that's just one flavor. There are a million different flavors in every country, and women are actually borrowing. They're making livelihoods out of all of them because we seem to have this idea that somehow debt will solve it. And I just want to complicate that idea a little bit because this is a complicated issue that isn't going to have a single solution. So I'm not saying that something we think of as microfinance doesn't have a role to play, just that we need to have a little bit more of a clear idea of what exactly it is that we're talking about. So I agree that women's solidarity around money, having more money in women's hands are all really important things. They lead to better nutrition. They lead to all of these different things. But we can't divorce that from the political structures through which that's delivered. So I just want to kind of put that out there. We do need to pay attention to the institutions, the delivery mechanism, the context in which these connections to finance are being provided to women of all backgrounds and take into account the specific context in which they're functioning. The women that I talked to were not rural. They were living in urban areas. They were not impoverished. They were working class. They had access to their own, they were domestic workers. They had, so we need to understand women not as a single category, but within their particular context if we're to really find solutions to gender depression.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is a very complex issue, a complicated issue, as you said. I would like to go back to Africa. African countries, Prudence, have some of the highest numbers of women entrepreneurs per capita in the world, which I find amazing. What are some of the key challenges that women entrepreneurs who are working or you are working with are facing, and how can we work to overcome these challenges that they have and promote greater gender equality in the business world as well?
So these women have conquered, but the challenges are immense. I mean, there's so many of them. One of the biggest challenges I think we always talk about is the aspect of finance, which is what we're discussing today. How do they access finance to actually sustain? Because what they're looking for is a more sustainable source of funding that they can receive. We're talking about microloans which come and you find that there are enough statistics around how much you need to feed your family, how much you need to take your children to school. But when they apply for funding, they're just receiving enough which cannot take them beyond to sustain their businesses. So I think that's a very key aspect. And I'm from the agricultural sector, and we're always saying that when you do not finance the women to the level that is required for them to be sustainable, then it means they're only going to focus on the smaller businesses. They can't invest in the premium kind of products. They can't invest in livestock. There's limited funding or limited profits they make. So that money is just circulating around household support. And in turn, the businesses tend to fail. But they're not failing because women are not capable. They're failing because they did not get the right type of funding at the right cost. The other aspect I would want to talk about is the time allocation to them managing their businesses, which is very key. When we talk about the time allocation, a woman has to wake up, make sure that the husband is well dressed, whether they're going to work or they're going to sit around with their friends outside and chat. But also the other communal tasks that they have. It's not just their home that they're looking after. The other communal tasks that they have to take are taking so much time away, productive time away from the women business entrepreneurs. So while she's trying to juggle the aspect of keeping the home in check, she's also trying to make sure that her business is run successfully. They cannot afford to bring in employees. So she's also the one who's running the business, and in turn, that diversion of time it's quite divided unequally, and she's not able to run a successful business. The other aspect is just financial literacy. We really overlook financial literacy, business acumen that can be extended to these entrepreneurs. Right now, there's so many cohort programs or accelerator programs that are being run in Africa. There's so many donor institutions that have come on board. Again, women do not have the time to go and sit in these training sessions. Is there a way that women could be capacity building happening so that they can access digital platforms and they can listen to these trainings in their local language and they can do it from home? Instead, when there's a cohort program, they expect these women to come and gather around, and she's going to have to sit or invest 3 to 4 hours. And some people come and say, if you can't invest the time, then we can't invest in you. That's not possible. So you're looking at the capacity building structures that are being set. They're not ideal for the women, especially the small business entrepreneurs. And those are just some of the challenges. I could go on and on, but these are some of the challenges that small business entrepreneurs are facing. And what we can do about it is to sort of design programs that are ideal to the cultural norms, programs that are ideal to the settings that do exist in certain communities. What is applied here cannot necessarily work in another state. What is applied in another state cannot necessarily apply to another group. And I think that's the challenge where I listened to our opening ceremony yesterday. It was around media, and they're talking about how you need to bring in the right speeches, the right media display. Is the same even when you're extending to the support for women business entrepreneurs. You need to look at the environment and actually tailor your solutions to be ideal to the community you're serving.
So it's also, as you said, a mindset that has to change, but maybe also our system has to change, Linda. Can we trust that modern capitalism can evolve into a gender equitable system, or do we need new structures altogether to actively prioritize inclusion?
So the first thing I would say is that it's a mistake to think that women's inequality is caused by capitalism, okay? Because it's much older and much uglier and much stronger than capitalism. This system is. Like I said, it dates about thousands of years. Now, the question of can we deal with it now, I think yes, although we've been talking a lot, as particularly in that panel this morning, about maintaining trust in the world order. And the global effort to empower women economically depends mightily on the rules of, and the alliances of the world order. And so I'm feeling a little bit less trust in that myself now. But during my career, I have really seen that it is possible for the capitalist system to move in such a way that women can be made freer. I do think that all the things Prudence was just saying are absolutely true. It's really important to understand that it's not just finance that is a problem. And in fact, there have been some terrible stories about women getting credit, all right, but then they can't access markets. They're not enough financially literate. There are all of these things that all sort of come together to hold her in place. It takes an ecosystem. It takes a village. It also takes really a surgical approach. Very careful, because it's also important to recognize that what holds this whole system in place is the threat of violence. And these days, when you go into a developing country and you try to get an IRB, an ethics approval to go in and do a study like this, if you're dealing with finance, you have to tell them what your plan to deal with domestic violence is. You have to tell them up front. That tells you how closely money and violence are related in the home. And just one thing, if I can, I think it's really important, I feel it's important when I'm in Europe to be very clear, because people tend to look at this as a developing world problem. This is not a developing world problem. Some of those dots, those red dots on the graph, are European countries. The land ownership in the Netherlands is about the same as some of the poorest and most oppressive Middle Eastern countries. The overall average of the developing nations is below the global average. Women don't have any more access to capital or credit here than, for business purposes, here than in other places. So nobody should be saying, oh, but we know all the stuff, we know how to do it, because we don't.
You said something interesting because you made this relation to the panel this morning on trust and international relations, and you were also invited last September to Berlin to the German Foreign Offices Conference on Shaping Feminist Foreign Policy. And afterwards you wrote on your blog why the governments of the world need to adopt feminist foreign policy. So explain to us, and I think you had already just touched on that, but I think it's interesting, why is it taking a gender lens to international relations also important for economic policies, as you argue? Maybe you can just tell us a little bit why that's important.
Yes, I think feminist foreign policy, I think it's kind of an odd name. I would want to call it something like gender smart policy. But it is feminists that we're talking about, and mostly what it is, it's recognizing that you have problems that are world problems, peace, hunger. The United Nations tells us that we could feed 1 million of the world's chronically hungry if we just leveled that playing field on land and agriculture. So it's a big deal. But these are restrictions that are visited only on women, not on men. Okay, and so if you go in and you say, oh, well, we're going to give everybody access to credit, what that does is it replicates the existing system. You have to say, the women have this problem and we're going to deal with this problem that they have. And that gives you both the growth and the removal of some of those terrible things. Now, some of those terrible things that I just told you, war, trafficking, geopolitical instability, world hunger, all of these are of concern in international policy, right? Mm-hmm. So because it's a much bigger problem than people have understood before, it makes a lot of sense. And many countries are starting to do it because it makes a lot of sense. Mm. And I can't begin to tell you there's just huge amount of data behind this. This is just the surface. There's a huge amount of data.
Mm. So Prudence Linda argues, as she just said, male dominance in developing countries contributes mightily to instability, poverty, hunger, and violence in those countries. We just heard it, and we saw it also. So as long as gender inequality prevails, they continue to be that way. Now let's talk about sustainability, because there's also a link. Because in this field, studies also show that achieving sustainability in agriculture relies on gender equality. Now, you are the head of finance of COMACO and a member of the Rallying Cry Network, so supporting climate and gender responsive agricultural enterprises in Africa. How is the empowerment of women and girls related to the future of our planet, of the environment and the climate crisis?
Well, that's very cardinal. I mean, I'm coming from an institution that's working with over 250,000 households, and these are all in the rural setup. And our statistics have proven that 52% of these farmers are women. And each year, we are buying excess grain from these farmers, and then we are selling them and getting into the value chain process. We're not even able as an institution to offtake everything that is being produced. And the reason why there's been much productivity is because women are leading. Sorry about that. One thing I would note is outside 52% of the farmers being women, we actually have most of our senior lead farmers who are the individuals that motivate, that encourage, that inspire others to adopt conservation agriculture and smart agricultural practices, which are more sustainable from a rural perspective because of the smaller pieces of land that these households do own. You find that the senior lead farmers are women. We have our farmers working in certain groups, and these groups are sort of a cooperative structure, And most of these cooperatives are led by women. And we actually have the first federation of cooperatives that was enacted last year, and it is led by a woman. So when you're looking at the sustainability aspect and the importance of empowering the women and the girl child, we're already seeing of the productivity that's coming out of that. But this also comes from a perspective where the social norms are allowing women to speak out. The social norms are allowing women's voices to be heard, for women to be able to stand up and say, I can do this, and I have the men around me, the other women around me, the children that we are rearing and that are growing up are inspired by what these women are achieving. So we can see the progress women have made, but we're also seeing the importance, because already, I mean, I'm sure you've all read and watched movies on African perspective, how women do nurture everything that they take care of, they touch. That woman's touch is very important to our culture, and we see that when that woman's touch is spread to a business perspective, to agriculture, to feeding the nation. We saw what happened during the pandemic, and there was evidence, research, and statistics that did prove the role that women played to keep the homes afloat, to sustain the economy, to feed the families in moments where things were tough. We actually noted that our rural families did not starve. People from the town were actually relying on the food that was coming from the rural settings. And all this was coming from the empowerment that was derived by the pandemic, the financial systems that leaned on the gap that existed around women's support in terms of the financial capacity. We all noticed all those changes. So I'm putting in a lot of things, but everything that happened around the pandemic, the financial systems that evolved and that supported women, we saw the changes that did take place. And our hope and trust is that we do not let what the pandemic generated go away, but we cultivate on that, and then we continue to see this support being cultivated further and empower more women.
I saw Smitha smiling at one of the comments that you made, that the rural families were not starving. I think do you have anything to add to that? Did you have the same experience maybe in India or in your research?
Yeah, so there's a number of threads in the. I'm sorry, because I'm distant, I can't read the room or like interview.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm trying. I mean, if you have a question, just raise your finger, then I'll see it, or you want to add something.
Yeah, no, a couple of things to say. I really enjoyed hearing, Prudence, some of the context that you've given us from Zambia. And indeed, a lot of research, so if you look at some of Bina Agarwal's recent research, and Bina Agarwal is the leading scholar on land inheritance and gender, and more recently she's looked at collective farming in Kerala and shown that women-led collective farming has been incredibly successful. And the pandemic, but a lot of similar results to what you've described, Prudence, in the context of Gambia. And I think one important theme to highlight, also going back to Linda's earlier comments about foreign policy and what would a feminist foreign policy look like, is that gender, if we're going to talk about gender as a critical building block of the world, a fairer future that we would all like to live in, gender is relational. So the idea that somehow we can go in and give women some things and keep it away from men, I feel leads us down a dangerous path, because this is about addressing the relationships of inequality that exist, and that has to be done within the context of the very particular cultures, structures, institutions that exist on the ground. And so I think that we need to, if we're really trying to address the complexity of the issue, it has to be done, it has to be addressed in that way and from the bottom up. So Prudence, what you described as women in the collective, kind of looking to the men, the women, and the children who are in their communities and seeking interconnection and upliftment there, and then building a bottom-up kind of economic empowerment from there, seems to me to be a promising direction, and does take on capitalist structures in some way. And so I think that we need to be real about the way that type of collective organization and addressing relational understandings and practices of gender does challenge prevailing capitalist structures. And I think that we need to be very clear about the fact that that's not the same as the prevailing, producing cash crops for the global economy, highly specialized types of production. This has big implications for the way that our current the particular capitalist global order that we're in right now is run. And I think we can't shy away from those questions. That's how big they scale up.
Linda is keen to go in there.
No, I just did want to build on those comments. This morning, once again, we were talking about the world order and everything. It's one of the reasons I think we're all so shocked about Russia and Ukraine is because we didn't see it coming, in part because we have been lucky enough to grow old, in my case, in the longest period of world peace that has ever occurred. It's called the Long Peace, right? And it is the result of the international order that was initiated after World War II with the idea of trying to have international institutions that fostered peace. And the experts that I read say that there are three things that have made that happen. One is the rise of democracy, one is the expansion of international trade, and the third is the increase in gender equality. All right, so it is a powerful, powerful thing. And what we see pretty much worldwide is men answering surveys when they're asked, is gender equality important to their country, saying yes. Most countries, the majority say yes of the men. In Western Europe, it's upwards of 90%. And I think that is part of what this world order has done, is it has created a potential to have allies and not just conflict. I think it's between men and women, I think it's very important to grasp that this is not a zero-sum game. That it's very clear from the research that just because women get something, the men have to lose. This is the thing that frightens them so much, and it just doesn't pan out like that, and I think we have to have faith. I think this is a moment. Somebody said last night that in one language, trust meant putting hope in someone. I think we need to put hope in our fellow human beings, and I think we can do this. I think we can do it. I would not be here talking about it if I didn't.
But I would like to ask maybe Smitha, because this is quite interesting. You say that most men in Western countries, want gender equality, and they have, that we should have hope. But maybe is it in countries where there is more of a patriarchal system, where there is more, more male domination? Is there maybe more fear? Can you see that from your research, that men are more scared of giving or sharing, power, surface, like land, whatever it is, financial resources? Smitha, what do you see? Can you see that in your research as a sociologist?
So I think that we need to be careful about giving a geography to men loving patriarchy and power. We're in a moment where we see very regressive masculinities rising up all over the world, whether it's the US, whether it is all over Europe, whether it is in India. So we see the rise of patriarchal strongmen who are and Putin, really building up this idea of traditional masculinity as providing a kind of safety for the world order, which has gone too far in the other direction. And so that's attractive to lots of men who feel that they've lost out in the current scenario. And I think we need to look more closely at that throughout the world. In my research in India, I met many, many compassionate men who want the world to be better for women. In fact, most of the men that I spoke to feel that way because they're either working in microfinance or they are, with women who are taking loans, et cetera. So there's a kind of stereotype that exists even within the microfinance industry that women are better borrowers because men are irresponsible and love their power and their drink. But that's not necessarily the case on the ground, right? So we need to think about, just think about, again, relationality, the multiple scales at which that occurs, and the fact that there is not, when we say patriarchal areas of the world, the U.S. is feeling like a pretty patriarchal part of the world right now since we lost Roe v. Wade, just the changes that are happening right now. I don't think that we can regionalize this so easily. It's very convenient for us to do that. But
I totally agree with you, by the way.
Yeah, I think I didn't mean to say that there's, in fact, I think I definitely said that I wanted to be asked about Ukraine.
Yes.
Because
and
that
I would like to give actually the audience the chance to ask you about Ukraine.
Because it speaks to what she's saying about patriarchy emerging in other countries.
Yeah, I agree.
Including
and
the
also
US.
The war. We forgot about the Cold War. I just think that's like a really important part of the geopolitical context that's produced the world.
Yes, absolutely. Let's see if there is questions from the audience, if anybody wants to ask you about Ukraine, Linda, as you suggested earlier. If not, then you can just say it if you want to say it. But I'd love to see if there's any questions to our three panelists. And if so, I bring you the microphone. So I move a little bit. And maybe you can just tell us your name and your question. Sorry, can you hand it? Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Zuzana and I'm from Slovakia. I'm a sociologist and I work in urban design and urban planning. And thank you for your presentations. I will not ask about Ukraine because I live like 80 kilometers and I think I know a lot. And I visited several times during the war. But what you mentioned about ownership of land and credits is very much speaking to me because of urban planning and architecture. We often come into discussion of how much land is accessible for equality in housing or equality in providing decent access and inclusivity in cities. So maybe I'm here to ask you for advice. If you can say what would be good strategies for women to access land, what maybe come from different parts of the world that we can get inspiration from. That would be my question. Thank you.
Thank you. So do you have any one of them, or Linda, or Prudence, or Smitha? All of you. So who wants to start? Prudence?
So I'm going to start because I think I'll have a less technical perspective to it.
Yeah.
But what I was looking at is, from our perspective, it's more of family land. And this family land is registered in the husband's name, right? So in terms of borrowing, in terms of accessing any financial benefits, the husband is the only one that can go with the title deeds because they're registered in his name. But also, where it doesn't end there. I am the firstborn of 2 kids, and we're both girls. And I could share my personal experience where after my parents died, it has taken us longer to acquire the land that they left because my father's relatives feel that we are girls and we should not take over our parents' inheritance. Yet this is everything they worked for. But if they had a son, it would have been much easier. So from a family perspective, from a woman's perspective, why not have the title deeds registered in the family name, or that in both the husband and the wife's name, so that they can be accessible by both? That way, there is sort of much equality and access to finance if the wife needs to go and access any loans. So that's another solution from, really basic solution that can exist. Currently now, it's the man who has title deeds, or the woman doesn't have any access to land because if traditional land is being distributed, it's the list of men that are submitted either to the chief or to the councillor in the area, and women come in last, and by that time, all the land has been distributed. So that's another perspective of how to bring equality and how women can access land.
Smitha, do you have something to add? Then I give.
Sure, I can say a little bit about the South Asian context. So 2005, Hindu Succession Act was passed, which made it legal for women to inherit land and made that part, normalized it. However, since that act has been passed, very few women have actually taken advantage of that, and there hasn't been a huge shift in patterns of land ownership. In South Asia and Nepal, there's been some efforts also to redistribute land to women, not all of which have been successful. And so I think that the research in South Asia, at least, has shown that there needs to be legal changes on the books, but there also needs to be widespread grassroots education for women to understand how to access those legal entitlements. And that combo is pretty difficult. So then what you have at the local level is often resistance to prioritize, right, legal education for women in order for them to actually access the entitlements that they already have on the books. So it needs to be a multi-pronged strategy, and it needs to come, you know, both from the top down and the bottom up. So you need policy change, you need institutional changes, and you need a kind of very active, continuously renewed on the ground commitment. There's some recent research in India to suggest that a lot of these types of development interventions require some bureaucratic fixes where you have a kind of audit, right? So let's say you get an educational kind of NGO effort on the ground that's about legal rights, right? But then maybe you have a state-level bureaucratic audit that comes in once every other year to ensure that that group is doing their job, right? And that there's some awareness that's being raised here. So I think we have to be innovative not only about the laws on the books and the activism on the ground, but also the bureaucratic structures that can oversee them. And we see a wide variety of examples about that in the research on South Asia.
Linda, do you have anything to add? Or
yeah, I think that land rights and things like that, all these things, joint titling, all these things are very important, and they are very practical. They're right there on the ground. But it is still the case, just as in Prudence example, that you'll have laws, and then it's very hard to act on them. They're not well enforced. And they're hard to enforce, and particularly in the rural areas, and people don't even know what the law is and don't frankly really care. And the uncle will just take the land and the community will support him in doing so, kind of thing. It's very, very difficult. I do think that, personally, I think it is important to recognize, I would like to see women everywhere working to solve this problem. Women only get a tiny slice of international aid, and yet we know that this is one of the most effective ways of stopping world poverty, for example. In order to do that, in order to convince people that this is big enough, and in order to get it done, I think that the women of the world literally need to start seeing themselves as an interest group, as a group of people who suffer from the same injustices. We have tended for the last, 50 years to treat gender as if it's culturally local, all right? But what this data is showing us is that there is a very strong global pattern, just like that picture I showed you of fertility. When you have data, the data in front of you, it is so strongly patterned. It's so strongly patterned that you can imagine seeing it from space, all right? This is a global problem, and I would like to see it be addressed as a global problem, and that's going to mean that the women and their allies who are male need to pitch up.
Absolutely. Another question from the audience? Dina? I know, of course, only with the microphone.
I'm wondering if also investments are part of this, because I know this conversation was mainly about loans, but honestly, as a media entrepreneur, I'm a female founder of a startup. I've witnessed how hard it is for me to access funds. Obviously, there is a bias. Most of the investors are male, and I think this has to do with historically that also male-dominated like the executive levels in companies, and then after they left, they managed to use the wealth they accumulated through their careers, and then chose to invest it or start their own ventures, and then it became the cycle of the men. And I wonder how do you envision the future, as I know there is this huge discussion in every field about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and as we start seeing more women getting to that level, does this also will hopefully lead to changing this, and how also to to ensure that women have access to finance, but not through loans, through investments. Because, for example, in Africa and the Middle East, only 1% of female-led startup got funding in the last year, which is, I think, is a very low percentage. And although there are many organizations that claim that they would support female founders, what we're seeing, even when there is a female investor, she still would invest in male because the calculation is based on money rather than gender. So how can we change this?
Thank you very much, Nina. Any particular person you would like to have this answered? Anyone who feels...
So this is exactly what happens. That picture you just drew is what it is. It is the exclusion is almost the same in numbers from investment as it is from capital in the form of credit. It's my view that a lot of what propels this, as I said earlier, is the fact that these are male-only, virtually male-only institutions, and it's, as a rule of thumb, above 70% male control. All right, like on a corporate board or something, you're going to have a problem with this kind of thing. So what you suggest in terms of having women leaders, I think we need to be careful about that being just a quick pat fix. But the research does show that when you get above 30%, things do change.
You would like to add something, Prudence?
And I can also see Smitha. She's saying
Smitha is.
So I was listening to the question from different perspective, and I was thinking about when you're looking at financial inclusion, it's not just about borrowing, but also encouraging women to invest. So I'm not looking at somebody coming to invest in you, but how you as a woman can start saving. And I think that's an aspect when you're looking at trust. That's an aspect that enhances trust, because you're not just looking at a finance system just positioning itself to get something from you through their extension of credit, but they're also investing in you so that you can save, and you're encouraging different aspects of growing your financial stability. And I've been itching to say this because I find it so funny, and just us coming from Women's Month, there's a statement which was, if you want to attract women from a financial perspective, they say you pink it and shrink it. And the assumption was every other product that is coming on board that is being marketed towards women is not different. It's not looking at the aspects that do serve the challenges that women face. It's not enhancing women to actually have trust in the financial system. They are just changing the branding, you pink it, and then it's become a woman's product. So when you're looking at even in the investment aspect, you need to actually design a product that is ideal, that sets the challenges, that looks at the challenges that women face. There's an aspect of confidentiality, there's an aspect of collateral that we're talking about. We're looking at women living longer, so they actually need to have savings. So what are you doing around that? And when talking about investment, you need to tailor them to actually suit the gender that you're approaching. So, yeah.
We're running out of time, but Smitha, do you have something to add?
I was just going to make a very quick comment following up on something that the person who asked the question said, that even when women have a choice about who to invest in and their investors, they often pick men as well. And that just sort of follows up on what Linda was saying, is that maybe if we get a 30% critical mass, that would help. But I also think the valuation systems that we use about what counts as a good business need to shift, because it's so bottom line driven. And the assumption is that is the common sense for business. But I think there needs to be a real examination of what that common sense is and what counts as a good investment. And that's not been questioned in a fundamental way. And getting more women on board doesn't necessarily address that, that kind of economistic type of thinking, if we're really thinking about what it would take to build a fair, more gender equal financial ecosystem.
Thank you so much. This is unfortunately all we have time for, although I'm sure we could talk for another hour, but there are still plenty of other panels and discussions and plays to come, so here at the Kultursymposium. So I say thank you very much to our panelists, Linda Scott, Prudence Muchinouta, and Smitha Radhakrishnan for being with us, although you are sick and at home. Thank you so much for getting up early. I know it's really early. I think you had to get up extra for us, so thank you so much for taking the time. And all the insights, it was really truly inspiring. And sorry, Linda, that we didn't talk again about the Ukraine, but we'll do it now over a coffee, because there is a coffee break coming up. And thank you all for being here. I just would like to give you a couple of announcements before I let you go. The next events this afternoon will not take place here on the festival grounds. So we will move to other locations in the city of Weimar, but it's small, as you have probably realized, so it's not that difficult. My colleagues from the Goethe-Institut will be very happy to guide you to the respective venues, and will wait for you outside at the end of the coffee break, which is at 3:50, so that's 10 minutes to 4. So to find your destinations, just follow the balloons. I think we did that yesterday after the beginning of this whole session. So if you want to join the discussion Voices of Change, please follow the balloon to the Bauhaus University. Those who would like to take part in the Trust Lab or the workshop The New Me at the Bauhaus Museum, please follow the respective balloons to the Bauhaus Museum. And if you want to visit the exhibition You Know That You Are Human, please follow the balloon to Galerie Eigenheim. So again, the balloons to the afternoon locations will start at 3:50, so that's 20 minutes from now, enough time to grab a coffee or a tea. Thank you so much for being with us. Enjoy the rest of the afternoon and take care of yourself. Bye-bye.